Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our seminar on taxonomy for Hong Kong. I'm Kathy from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and on behalf of the HKMA, HKUST, and HKGFA, we're delighted to welcome you here and those who are joining us on Zoom. Without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Enoch Fung, CEO of the Hong Kong Academy of Finance, who will deliver opening remarks. Mr. Fung, please.
Thank you very much. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Again, a very warm welcome to the Hong Kong Academy of Finance. Very warm welcome again to also this afternoon's seminar co-organized by the HKMA, HKUST, and HKGFA. Last year, the Hong Kong Academy of Finance co-hosted an event with HKGFA and HKUST in this very room. We discussed the need for better ESG disclosures to facilitate investment and risk analysis in realizing the energy transition goals in Asia. Today's seminar is on the taxonomy for Hong Kong, which I believe will take last year's discussion at a deeper level. Climate change is already a reality that affects everyone and everywhere. Last summer, Hong Kong was hit by a super typhoon and was also suffering from a widespread flooding and landslides caused by torrential rain. The observatory recorded the highest one-hour rainfall since record began in 1884, and within a 24-hour period, the rainfall in Hong Kong reached a quarter of its annual average rainfall. These extreme weather events are occurring more and more frequently, causing losses to life and property. Throughout this week, we have heard a lot about Hong Kong as an international financial center and how we can help to promote sustainable finance in Asia. Through these discussions, we can further promote thought leadership on a broad variety of international important policy and regulatory issues like green standards and taxonomy, which in turn can make valuable contributions across different sectors and different geographies. For a green taxonomy to be useful and effective, it needs to be complemented by a vibrant capital market ecosystem supported by good policies. Indeed, as Asia's leading bond hub, Hong Kong is already the largest center for arranging international green and sustainable bond issuances from Asia, capturing more than one-third of the region's issuances. This provides a solid foundation for market innovations. For example, Hong Kong made use of the government green bond program to innovate and expand the product set in terms of currencies, tenors, and distribution channels to help establish benchmarks for the broader bond market. This includes the issuance of the world's first tokenized green bond last year, government green bond last year. Meanwhile, the Green and Sustainable Finance Cross-Agency Steering Group, which is a consortium of financial regulators and government agencies in Hong Kong, has issued a number of key initiatives to strengthen Hong Kong's financial ecosystem in the space of sustainable finance. This includes leveraging technology to support sustainability reporting and data analysis and collaborating with regional and international partners on capacity building. The steering group has also been working hard in developing a prototype of Hong Kong taxonomy, drawing largely from the China-EU Common Ground taxonomy, with focus on areas and activities that are more directly relevant to Hong Kong's transition path. These efforts are important for two reasons. First, as a critical part of the market infrastructure, there is a need to establish a clear reference for local authorities and market participants in determining whether an activity and its products is truly green and sustainable. Second, we need to consider how to ensure international interoperability while taking into account jurisdiction-specific industry classifications. Capacity building is also crucial in promoting the understanding of a taxonomy and the subject of sustainable finance in general. The HKGFA and many universities in Hong Kong, including the HKUST, have been doing a lot of work on capacity building and on the education front. The HKMA and other financial regulators have also been rolling out concrete measures with financial institutions and capacity building organizations to deepen our pool of financial sustainable finance talent. There is a huge scope to do more. In fact, the Hong Kong Institute for Monetary and Financial Research under the AOF recently published a comparative study focusing on talent developments across the leading global financial centers. We observed that there is a clear shortage of talents with expertise in both finance and environmental subjects, and the competition for these talents across the world is fierce. But what also stands out from our data analysis of 1.6 million LinkedIn profile data is that the finance professionals in Hong Kong demonstrated the fastest pace of upskilling relative to their peers in 8 other international financial centers. This attests to the resourceful environment in Hong Kong for upskilling the expertise, which of course is a positive catalyst for building our talent pool in the longer term. The Academy of Finance was set up in collaboration between the HKMA, the Securities and Futures Commission, the Insurance Authority, and the Mandatory Provident Fund Authority. And our mandate is to promote financial leadership and also research collaboration. And we've been featuring green finance in our various leadership development and also research programs. Ladies and gentlemen, I've only touched briefly on some of the themes around taxonomy today and the role of Hong Kong as a sustainable finance hub, but I'm sure you'll get a lot more comprehensive update on the latest progress on the green classification and taxonomy adoption in Hong Kong. So an exciting set of agenda ahead of us this afternoon, and I do hope you enjoy the discussion. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Enoch. Before we invite our speakers on stage, may I remind you that there will be Q&A time in each session. Audience may submit their questions through scanning the QR code here. For the first half of the seminar, we're honored to have representatives from the HKMA, HKUST, and HKGFA to deliver a presentation on the latest taxonomy. Mr. Willie Mack, Chief Manager of Banking Policy at the HKMA, will first talk about the latest progress of the local green classification framework. Mr. Mack, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to be here to talk about the latest development in taxonomy in Hong Kong. And in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about briefly about an overview of taxonomy development, as well as the latest, the consultations, feedback, and some initial thinking about the way forward. Okay, so maybe a bit of introductory background. Especially for those who may be new to this area. The taxonomy basically, in a very simple term, is a classification system to identify activity for investment or investment that are considered environmentally sustainable. So it is important market infrastructures in the market, because if we aim to achieve the Paris Agreement, the climate goal in Paris Agreement, we got to upstream the green financing. And there need to be some benchmark on what activities should be regarded as green. So in this regard, we published a discussion paper last year in May. We outlined our thinking as well as the structures and core elements of our prototype framework, which basically cover 4 major sectors, covering the most emission in Hong Kong, power generations, transportation, constructions, and water and waste management. And in our framework, a very key objective is to align with the mainstream taxonomy, because Hong Kong is only a very small city and with very small physical footprint. But as an international financial center, we would like to leverage our role as an IFC and to facilitate international green finance flow. And therefore, our aim is to align with the mainstream taxonomy, the common ground taxonomy, as well as the China and EU taxonomy. So the consultation. In our consultation, we reach out to stakeholders, including financial sector participants, industry association, academia, the think tank, and NGO. We also organize some outreach sections and hear their feedback. And in general, the feedback are quite positive. Respondents welcome the development of the Hong Kong taxonomy, because it helps us reinforce our role as an international financial center. They are also of the view that the taxonomy can help reduce greenwashing risk and to provide a clear definitions about green. In line with our discussion paper, the comments could be summarized into the following 3 areas. First of all, the taxonomy design and structure. There are suggestions that our taxonomy should incorporate a broader context. That means not just Hong Kong, in the case of Hong Kong, but also the regional context, the Greater Bay Area, and the Asian economy. And there are also suggestions that we should recognize some widely recognized framework in the market, for example, those relating to green bond or green loans. And lastly, there are also suggestions or questions about the way forward. because it is considered that the taxonomy should not be a static document, it should be a living one. And there are also updates in terms of definition and also in terms of criteria. So there are also questions about that. And secondly, there are also questions about the metrics, technical screening criteria, and the threshold in the taxonomy. For example, there are suggestions that we should not only consider the BIM for the building, for example, we should not only consider using referencing BIM Plus for buildings in Hong Kong, because there are also others green building certificates such as LEED, which is also widely used for Hong Kong building. And there are also suggestions to make reference to other green product certification scheme in the market. So these these comments and suggestions will be considered fully in our determinations of the next phase of work. And thirdly, there are also suggestions about the next step. Specifically, this is about respondent raised about the need to prioritize our work into development of other green activity as well as other transition activity. There are also specific suggestions on the type of activity to be included in the next phase of work. And also, there are also some clarifications about the implementation as well as the timeline of implementing the taxonomy and the level of verification that in terms of implementation. So what would be our way forward? And well, we identified several key areas that would be form our next phase of work. The most importantly, we will cover a range of new sectors, activity, and importantly, the transition activity. On new sector and activity, we will consider to expand the coverage of green activity by leveraging on the common ground taxonomy, for example, because so far we only cover 4 of the sector, but definitely we will expand to cover other sectors which are of importance to this part of the world. And more importantly, we will also expand to cover transition activity. You know, Hong Kong does not have much carbon-intensive industry, but we do believe that we could leverage our role as an IFC and to facilitate the transitions of this area. So we will prioritize transition activity for Hong Kong, for China, as well as for the Greater Bay Area. And apart from climate change mitigation, the current taxonomy, only covered climate change mitigation. So we are also considering to expand it to cover others environmental objectives, such as climate change adaptation. And next, we also consider the other important element in the taxonomy, which, for example, the do no significant harm and the minimum social safeguard. These 2 elements are part of the integral part in the EU taxonomy, so we will consider how to incorporate them, but not to, we also take into account the burden or the burden of proof or the burdens of verifying with this extra criteria. So we will see how that could be integrated into our framework. And number 5, we will also strengthen our collaborations with the industry and engagement. During the consultation, we received quite a lot of feedback from the industry and stakeholder, and we plan to maintain the dialogue with our stakeholder. And so that when we going on in our next phase, we could take on the experience and expertise in this area. And lastly, we also think about how to implement. During the consultations, the views about implementation are twofold. On one hand, there are concerns about the timeline and the readiness of the market in implementing the taxonomy. For example, some are concerned about the readiness of data. On the other hand, there are also suggestions suggesting us to adopt a phased approach when implementing the taxonomy. So we hope we will take these concerns into account, and throughout the publications of the taxonomy, we hope to facilitate early adoption by the market and raising the awareness of the market and promote a common understanding about the green criteria, as well as to build up the experience of the market and to provide a foundation to support specific applications, such as the structuring of loan products and to making disclosure. So the taxonomy that we are working on is really just the first phase of our work, And after the launching, we will pay attention to the actual usage in the market, and we will definitely explore room for better improvement or enhancement in the taxonomy. So on new activity, we are going to, the next phase of work, we are going to incorporate a number of new activity. And some of the example or some of the suggestions raised in the consultation are as follows. In our work, we will look into the CGT. We also look into the China-EU taxonomy, as well as the latest development in this region. For example, the Singapore taxonomy, the ASEAN taxonomy, as well as the proposal that was available in the market. We will see how to incorporate these suggestions and incorporate into our next phase of work. In terms of transition activity in particular, well, they're actually quite a challenging task. As you know, in the market, for example, in the China taxonomy, the Green Bond Endorsed Project Catalog, which is basically a whitelist approach, which does not, or which only have a limited coverage about transition activity. And as you know, in the EU taxonomy, there are some coverage about transition and defining in terms of declining emission threshold with sunset day and for certain transition activity. But their coverage is also quite limited. And we also looked at recently, in recent years, in this region, the ASEAN taxonomy and the Singapore taxonomy, they are also making some proposal on the definition of transition activity by making use of a traffic light approach. So these considerations and developments are important when in our next phase of work. Because, for example, in the first part, we will need to consider how to embed this transition activity into our current framework, which only consists of green activity. So we need to consider how to adopt or creations of a transition label or creations of a specific category, and as well as the specific threshold and technical criteria for this activity. So our current thinking on this development is that, well, actually we are still working on the summarizing the industry feedback as well as clarifying some of the details from the details of feedback from the consultation, especially those regarding the operationalizing the taxonomy. So we are targeting to launch the taxonomy, the first phase of the taxonomy, around the middle of this year. And by that time, we will also make more clear about the way forward and probably to provide more details about how we are going to develop the next phase of our taxonomy. And lastly, I would also like to share some international development on this front. The IPSF, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which developed the Common Ground taxonomy, they are also actually expanding the taxonomy, the CGT, in terms of several areas. For example, they're expanding the EU-China comparison exercise. Currently, they have 72 activities, but they are also considering expanding to cover other environmental objectives like climate change adaptation. They're also trying to mapping the do no significant harm criteria among these two taxonomies. And more importantly, they are also expanding to cover the taxonomy of other IPSF jurisdictions, which in particular is about the Singapore taxonomy. So as you can see, the development of taxonomy is quite dynamic in this world. So we will definitely look into keep in view this international development in our next phase of work. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Willie. Let's invite Dr. Keith Chen, Assistant Professor at the Hong Kong UST, to share on their latest research and insight on taxonomies. Dr. Chen, please.
So good afternoon. This research talk is based on the seminar that I've given in MIT, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to present the academic perspective to you. So I'm Keith. I'm assistant professor from the Division of Environment from HKUST. And today I want to talk about the international credibility of taxonomies. So Hong Kong is one of the first markets in the world to operationalize CGT. A very natural question to ask is, do we have any empirical evidence that CGT is useful? And to answer this question, we leverage on a very useful and informative report from HKGFA. And actually our next speaker, Chani, is one of the lead authors of the report. And in the report, we look at several financial institutions domiciled in China which have already issued CGT-aligned green bonds. Okay, so we want to understand a bit what is the performance? Does it help the issuers at all? So here are the findings without talking about the methodologies in details. First of all, there exists a CGT premium. Okay, so it means that if an issuer uses the CGT as a label for the green bonds, it can enjoy a lower cost of capital. And then, of course, we do the usual calculation of comparing the yield of CGT label green bonds with comparable green bonds from the same issuer. Second point is that we actually have a surprising result that CGT has a spillover effect. If you use the CGT label and issue a green bond, it actually can increase the greenium for other green bonds from the same issuer as well. And this is the spillover effect that we find is a delightful discovery. And finally, is a result that brings us to the mechanism of how CGT works. These results only works for green bonds denominated in foreign currency. And in fact, it's actually speaking to the phenomenon that CGT is intended as a communication tool for international investors. You're speaking the greenness of your project to the international investors rather than the domestic investors. So it's kind of verifying the mechanism that we have in mind. Now we kind of have some ideas that CGT does help reduce the cost of capital to finance the green projects. The next question is how do we bring that further? How do we further enhance the international credibility of the taxonomies? Okay, so if you look at the European current development, we actually already see demand from the bankers in Europe. Given that there are so many different sustainable finance frameworks in the market, they are quite desperate for further clarity of comparability mechanisms. So they want to understand how green bonds that align with another framework can potentially help them fulfill the reporting needs to their own framework. So in the EU, of course, we're talking about CSRD. So in order to provide further clarity, I think a very logical step is to seek the regulatory endorsement from the European regulators. And we're talking about a future step because this is going to really provide a clarity to the comparability mechanism. In fact, this kind of proposal is quite aligned with some of the thinkings in G20. G20 recognized that international coordination of this taxonomy is quite crucial for cross-border sustainable financial flows. Okay? And so you may think that, are we trying to aim for perfect alignment? This is not exactly the case we're aiming for. What we are trying to do is we aim for alignment strategically. And as you can see here, G20 also recognized the importance that taxonomy or more generally green finance policies should be designed after taking into account the varying context of individual countries. So we are not aiming for this perfect alignment. Each individual jurisdiction should have their local characteristic embodied into the framework they're using. Okay. So now, if we talk about the situation like that, different jurisdictions have different taxonomies. They are not necessarily identical, which is the point of having an individual taxonomy. Then we have to answer a question. So if we want to have European investors to provide more endorsement, we necessarily have to address their concern. And one concern that really arises very commonly when we talk about these differences in stringency or frameworks is the problem of leakage. So essentially, problem of leakage is a phenomenon that when you have two jurisdictions with differing levels of stringencies in their regulation, there's incentives for companies to be relocated to jurisdiction with a lower stringency in order to dodge the stringent regulation. But of course, when we think about green finance, the situation is more complicated than that. After some discussion with economists from Princeton University, we find out that, well, actually what we are talking about here is different from the conventional leakage problem we have in mind. In the end, green investors are not stupid. We have evidence already that green investors can tell apart, they can distinguish the green bonds according to the use of proceeds. Okay, so they cannot just be fooled by the label. They actually look into the what are you actually supporting with your green bonds, and they determine how much greenium to confer on the green bonds accordingly. Okay, so when we talk about something like that, I would like to illustrate the leakage problem that we have in mind with the following example. So sustainable palm oil production here, in principle, is eligible under the ASEAN taxonomy, but it's not actually eligible in the EU taxonomy. Okay, so you may think that if you're the European investors, I can be strategic and smart. I can selectively endorse only the common ground. So I only endorse the solar projects and not endorse the sustainable palm oil production in the regulation. Okay, so if they do that, of course, the very straightforward result is that we encourage cross-border capital flow to ASEAN market. So green bonds in ASEAN that are supporting solar, they are going to get this boost in demand. Okay? But as the price is bid up, we will have a secondary effect happening here. And that's because, well, from the perspective of the ASEAN investors, they are not that fussy about the difference because the ASEAN taxonomy do not actually say that the sustainable palm oil is not eligible. So as a result of that, one thing that can happen is that we have a substitution effect. So the fact that the price is bidden up for the solar project issued in ASEAN means that the investors from ASEAN may divert the capital to the palm oil projects issued in ASEAN. Okay, so you may think that, well, from the ownership perspective, actually it doesn't really matter because the EU investors are still owning the green bonds that are aligned with the taxonomy. But if you think about the aggregate capital flow perspective, every $100 that is going to ASEAN, perhaps, I'm just an illustrative number, $30 is going to support palm oil projects that are not exactly aligned with the taxonomy. So this is a very critical problem we have to resolve when we think about how to gain more international credibility, because it also speaks to the fact that why we have to care about alignment with international best practices and standards. So there are four ways. So we don't just propose that there's a problem, we try to propose some solutions, how to resolve the leakage. And in the research papers that we have developed, we identify 4 ratios that regulators can potentially manipulate in order to resolve the problem. So there are 4 points here. First, support the issuance of credible green bonds through external review subsidy, and Hong Kong is already doing that. And there are other steps like try to align the stringency of strategic areas constrained by green capital availability. Okay, so third one is really do the negotiation with the EU regulators, because although we are not perfectly aligned, but remember the point of having individual varying contexts taken into account is to reflect common but differentiated responsibilities. So if careful negotiation would be quite important. And finally, if we can provide extra incentives for holding green bonds that are aligned with both the China taxonomy and EU taxonomy, we can actually reduce the leakage problem. So I've kind of gone through some of the research findings, and I want to spend maybe the last 2 minutes on something that is like we are currently developing. Is actually in response to the seminar this morning on net zero transition. Because when you think about net zero transition, I think we are no longer talking about the project basis. We're talking about company as an entity for transition. Okay, so one problem that we're facing now in sustainability-linked bond market, in talking about transition finance, or generally speaking, the ISSB disclosures, we are talking about disclosures that are forward-looking and aspirational, and as a result, investors actually have difficulty assessing the credibility. So you're given a plan, you're given a bunch of promises what will happen next year, but how do you know whether the company will do it at all? Okay, so in response to that, we actually develop an economic theory-based framework for assessing this corporate net zero transition credibility. And the special features is that we try to leverage on ISSB disclosures, which means that this data will be increasingly available in the market. So we already received, the research team from University of Oxford has expressed interest in the findings. Here in Hong Kong, we're thinking about taking it a step further. We're thinking about like trying to operationalize this, because in the end, for international financial center, international credibility is foundational. If we can, any one of you are interested in taking this forward, operationalize the findings, or even develop a rating for transition credibility, which will be one of its first kind in the market, please contact us. So our research actually is not just limited on taxonomy. We are supported by the Hong Kong government, RGC, and we answer a bunch of questions related to green finance policies in Hong Kong. Okay, all our research outputs are made freely available online for now. So if you are interested, please contact us, and we're going to send you the papers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Last but not least, please welcome Ms. Chao-Ni Kwan, Executive Vice President at the Hong Kong GFA, who will talk about local adoption of Common Ground Taxonomy. Ms. Kwan, please.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Chao-Ni Huang. I'm the Executive Vice President of Hong Kong Green Finance Association. I think I have the most challenging job and the easiest job as well after, on the back of Willie and Dr. Keith, with all the very good background of taxonomy development so far. So maybe I'll just focus a little bit on the use case, the implementation of the taxonomies in Hong Kong to just shed some light in terms of market usability. So I think a lot of things have already been said about, the benefits of having a taxonomy, right? And, through the working group at Hong Kong Green Finance Association, together with our partners at Greater Bay. So we actually have conducted a series of research based on taxonomies, looking at opportunities of a CGT-based taxonomy for Hong Kong, for this part of the world. And our second phase, which was also conducted a couple of years ago, is the use case scenarios and implementation consideration for policymakers as we are in the process of developing the taxonomy. And the most recent publication that we did was how do we operationalize it in GBA. So there has been a lot of thoughts going into the makeup of us to support policymakers in taxonomy developments in Hong Kong, in Greater Bay. And I hope that we can really shed a bit of light into how can we make it useful to, one, better define greenness, because greenwashing has been a key word in the last couple of years due to more scrutiny in the market for the right reason. And secondly is to expand the use of taxonomy beyond what we've seen, in the use of green bonds and green loans alike, right? There's more use cases in investment product development, in corporate disclosure, in investment disclosure. These are the additional consideration that we can really think about. And I think, when we did put this together, we also thought about use that to really make sure we are talking about the same thing, or at least people are aware of the gaps between different taxonomies, because that's also a very important aspect. I think in reality, it's impossible to make every taxonomy identical or identical. Otherwise, there's no point of doing a taxonomy, because each market, each region has their own development phase, technological barriers, social consideration to factor into. So the idea is to make sure we can flag, the gaps, so that an investors in EU, Dr. Keith talked about, the leakage of green capital, right? Investors in EU can understand that what they are getting into when they hold a green bond issued by a Chinese or by ASEAN issuer. The knowledge, the awareness of gaps, or the knowledge of differences is actually very valuable to address some of the concern, even in greenwashing. So, this is really the background why what we have been doing, and we do hope through that can really reduce the transaction costs for issuers and for investors. Enoch mentioned that Hong Kong already captured 1/3 of the sustainable finance issuance, in Asia. And imagine, we're talking about trillions of dollars of investments going into this area. So the market is much bigger than what we are currently capture. So the taxonomy can really help us to achieve that. So, with the taxonomies, we think the users are actually very broad. From financial market participants, such as banks, asset managers, asset owners, insurance company, credit rating agencies, as well as corporates, in terms of identifying, their investment, their activities in terms of alignment to the taxonomy, and use that to aid their disclosure, to share with their investors proactively or or when they're asked in terms of their alignment to these activities, right? And finally, policymaker would also benefit, from as a key user of the taxonomy in terms of addressing, greenwashing risk. It can be a disclosure requirement on banks or other financial institutions in terms of providing assets that can be mapped to a taxonomy that's endorsed by the local regulators. So this is really broad, users. And for the use cases, we have listed a few. Obviously, debt financing is one of the most important user group products in using the taxonomy. We have already seen it in the case of EU. In fact, we'll see more of the use case in EU with EU Green Bond Standard coming into effect from the middle of 2024. Part of that is requiring EU Green Bond issuer to align their use of proceed to EU taxonomy. Obviously, it's still a voluntary-based standard, but we do expect good participation or use from EU-based issuer. So the knock-on effect is that when Asian issuers issue a green bond in US dollar or in Europe and try to distribute it to EU-based investors, they would definitely ask the question if the green bond is aligned to EU taxonomy, right? And we believe the shortcut will be a CGT-based taxonomy to allow that quick identification for EU-based investors to understand the extent of alignment or gap that exists, in these kind of bonds, right? So debt financing is the most immediate, product that will benefit from a clear taxonomy. Secondly is the things that has been less talked about when it comes to investment strategies. So in our paper, we believe that we can actually apply the approach when they apply to bonds to other asset classes for investors as they develop their cross-asset investment strategies. For example, if you look at an equity investor, they can use the list of defined green activities and transition activity to identify companies that best fit in terms of as an enablers or technology providers to address the environmental and transition challenges in these economic activities, rather than a list that doesn't have a lot of strong authoritative support in the business activity identification. So this really help, particularly when investors form a basket of let's say green tech or green stocks, right? The taxonomy can really form as the basis to support investors, and that can also help investors to address any concern when it comes to greenwashing, because we also understand that a lot of regulators, including regulators in Asia Pacific, are also putting their hands on anything that can lead to greenwashing. So that really helped to address that issue. The same thing can apply for benchmark indexes. There has been so many indexes developed, ESG leadership, climate leadership, so on and so forth, right? With the taxonomy, it can a CGT-based taxonomy can really help to really pick up, the eligible green transition activities that can allow investors and to really have confidence on the underlyings. For disclosure, that's also something that we think would benefit from a CGT-based taxonomy. Certainly, I already mentioned that in EU, the EU taxonomy regulation is already in effect. EU Green Bond Standard will be in effect from middle of April. So a lot of investors and companies are already doing this, have done their exercise in terms of mapping their portfolio against the EU taxonomy, right? So as we are building a Hong Kong taxonomy with CGT in mind, disclosure can be an important application when the Hong Kong taxonomy rolls out. So that's one of the policy recommendations that the working group has put forward to. And it would actually help to standardize disclosure. For example, in a scenario when regulator requires banks to disclose their assets, to green asset ratio, right? Then the taxonomy is going to be a disclosure tool for banks or other financial institutions to look at their current asset book, to look at their asset inventory, to identify what is green, what is not green. Otherwise, there are just too many flying taxonomies that can be very confusing and difficult for banks in Hong Kong to adopt. So we do expect, or we do hope the taxonomy can also be used in disclosure requirements. And same thing goes to investor disclosure, as SFC has also been rolling out a lot of disclosure requirements, from portfolio-wide carbon emission disclosure. So that's something that can also aid in the disclosure milestone. And finally, is policy setting. For those who really keep tab of the budget yesterday, you have already seen a very good list of green measures in the green future part of the budget. So we believe taxonomies, a Hong Kong taxonomy, can really fit into that, the implementation of the budget. Particularly if you think about some of the incentive tools, right? And we already have, it make it very clear that in the budget, it will extend the grants, the Green and Sustainable Finance Grant Scheme, and the taxonomy alignment in the future. We believe could be a very important feature for eligibility in terms of using the grant scheme. And there's more in terms of the regulatory framework. And I think that the disclosure part earlier can also refer to being used in policy setting. So going, forward, I think, Willie has mentioned very well in terms of the steps forward for Hong Kong as the policymakers are shaping the Hong Kong taxonomy. So we also make an attempt through the working group last year to provide some policy recommendations as we are in the process of shaping the Hong Kong taxonomy. Expansion is something that we believe will really benefit the market broadly, as a lot of the fund managers, they need to make sure the universe is large enough for them to invest in order to form a green strategy for equity or for fixed income. So we believe, the expansion will really benefit the market for investors as well for issuers. So we propose additional 23 green activities that are very relevant for Hong Kong, GBA as a whole, as well as mainland China's net zero transition. In addition to that, we also added 3 high-impact, hard-to-obey sectors for transition as transition activities for future in consideration, as HKMA is working on plan to work on the transition activities in the future taxonomy. So it's something that I will elaborate a little bit more. On top of that, we provided thinking in terms of other considerations such as avoidance of carbon locking. How do we operationalize do no significant harm? That's something that's been really difficult in EU, and minimum social safeguard, and also bring green tech into the picture. We want to make sure the future taxonomy would reflect green tech as Hong Kong aims to build Hong Kong into a green tech hub in the future, right? And so the taxonomy, in fact, it's basically identify green activities, transition activities. So basically, it's really linking to the technology who can deliver the positive environmental benefits, right? So there are a lot of natural, organic connection to that policy agenda. And finally, is the expansion of use cases, which I elaborated already. So let's just look at, transition activities that the group has put together. We picked cement, steel, petrochemical as just examples. Certainly there are more, and it requires more time, more effort, from the industry to think about what are the other eligible. But we just want to trial how can we actually are we able to define eligible technical criteria for this kind of high impact sector that would not lead to any greenwashing concern, but at the same time important to deliver the net zero commitments. So these are the three sectors that we picked because we believe they are really high. They are high emitting sector in Guangdong, in Greater Bay, and they are part of Guangdong's net zero transition plan. And it would be very natural for Hong Kong to consider us. We are the financing hub to deliver, to bring the capital to finance these kind of activities. So we actually we have looked at a lot of research rather than coming up of technical threshold out of our own heads, right? We want to make sure these considerations are as credible as possible. So you can actually look at it as a melting pot of technical thresholds from acceptable level or satisfactory level all the way to best practices. So it actually provides a range for investors, for banks to look at, to understand, the transition spectrum. Because by definition, transition is a dynamic process. You cannot judge a transition, as good or bad, that's simple. So we believe, if it's within that range, all the way from NDRC industry average, China best class, and to EU net zero 2050 threshold, that range should provide confidence to the market to finance, to invest in. So we have summarized, the technical threshold here, looking at, available robust frameworks from the market. So certainly, NDRC is one of the places that we look for these kind of technical guidance, but at the same time, we incorporated CBI sector standards as well as EU standards, as well as industry decarbonization roadmaps to present you the range that are available in the market, because very often in the absence of a taxonomy including transition activities, the question or the fear that we have in the market is that people are so worried that it's greenwashing. They don't want to invest in, even though they believe in it deeply. So we do hope this can provide some answers or consideration as policymakers are expanding the taxonomy. So that's my presentation or sharing, with you of our HKGFA research so far. So I hope it's useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chani. Thank you all for your presentation. So in the next 10 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session. I'm sure that the audience will have some questions for our speakers after their very informative sharing. May we also invite our moderator on stage, Ms. Andrea Chen, Senior Manager of Market Development at the HKMA. Please also join me in welcoming our presenters to on stage again.
Chani, I have to admit that you're leaving me with an even more challenging job of moderating after 3 insightful and informative presentations. So luckily, our audience makes my life a little bit easier. There are a lot of good questions lining up. So they noticed that one thing 3 of you sort of mentioned is alignment. So on one hand, we do want comparability across different sectors, across different regions. But then on the other hand, we also need to take into account that different cities, different regions have their own characteristics. As Willie mentioned, Hong Kong, for example, don't really have that much heavy emission kind of industry that may not apply to the other parts of the world. And so standing at where we are today, which direction do you think we should lean towards? Do we want more localization, or do we want more standardization? Why don't we start with Chao-Ni, who left me with a very difficult job to moderate with the panel?
That's a tough question. I think we do need both. Standardization in the way that, the structure of a taxonomy, right? Because right now you actually just look at the prototype of the Hong Kong taxonomy. The structure is actually very comparable to other taxonomies, and it's very readable in the sense that we understand as a market practitioner, you can really understand, okay, what this activity means in terms of greenness, and that's kind of the technical threshold, so on and so forth. So standardization, I think, is there in terms of the structure, the format, but there are local characteristics that I actually do believe market can accept. Because for a lot of international investors, even for EU-based investors, they are not expecting Asia issuer to fully align to EU taxonomy. That's something that we actually learn from my day-to-day, right? So I don't think it's the right, it's the conception that EU taxonomy is a global taxonomy is correct. And in fact, a lot of investors that I work with, including Gabriel, can share a little bit, is that the robust local taxonomy can also work. But obviously, the degree of alignment or interoperability can help, right? The closer it is to EU, the easier for any internal justification within any of the investment organizations. But I believe transparency can be the best policy here. As I said, if we can easily identify the degree of alignment or if any gaps, that can actually address a lot of questions. Because you would know what you're invested in, instead of saying that, oh, it can be green, not green, it's just too blurry. So maybe it's just to be proactive to demonstrate any gap or it could be highly aligned, right? As you can see in the CGT, actually a large amount of activities are significantly overlap between EU and China definition. And in fact, some of the green activities in the China catalog is even more stringent than the EU standard. So that's something that investors need to understand, that Asian taxonomy, Hong Kong taxonomies, they are not worse than the so-called global taxonomies, that you see.
Thank you, Chani. Willie, so you actually already mentioned this a little bit as well, and you mentioned in your last slide where mainland is right now with its own taxonomy. So could you share us a little bit with us of your thought?
Yeah, I think Johnny just now has gave a very comprehensive answer about the standardization or localization. Well, actually, I think I share a similar view. And actually, in terms of standardization, I do believe that in terms of taxonomy, we do need a great amount of standardization. Otherwise, actually, the market is complaining about the potential fragmentation. So standardization is something good. I think that we should achieve. And but in the actual implementation, I think there are certain things we need to adopt and then localize. And just for example, in our taxonomy work, we in terms of building, for example, we actually have considered the local environment and incorporate the BIM Plus, which is a quite a local green building certification scheme. So and if we totally rely on this international framework, they won't have. It would be difficult for them to directly apply in Hong Kong. So certain level of localization is needed. But in terms of implementation, there are a lot of challenges. So we need to consider the situation in Hong Kong. And for example, as proposed in the Hong Kong GFA research, I think they suggest quite a range of different applications, and those kind of applications could be considered in our implementation. And yeah, so I think so in short, I think both localizations and standardizations are needed. And in terms of implementation, we do need to consider the local actual situation.
Kip, you actually already touched on this topic a little bit when you analyzed the green bond issuance. Anything else that the data is telling us?
Well, I try to answer this question more indirectly, because I think what's important is not what to do, but how to do it in a credible manner. Because let me take natural gas inclusion as an example, because it's so controversial. Whatever you do, people are going to say something about it. I think very important when we make a decision about the taxonomy design, we want to convince the stakeholders that it is aligned or serving an environmental objective. So we try to actually work on it a little bit, because I think natural gas is a big topic, not just for Hong Kong taxonomy design, but for many emerging markets. So we kind of look at how the decision should actually take into account the individual context as in G20, and we look at the relationship with carbon price. Turns out that carbon price will play an important role. Our findings show that if the carbon price is sufficiently high, then of course you can think about excluding natural gas will be a right decision. But remember, some people say that including natural gas in taxonomy may divert capital away from renewables. We have the opposite direction is that, well, you can also direct the capital from more polluting the power generation, right? So our finding shows that when we're talking about a context where the carbon price is non-existent or sufficiently low, actually including natural gas in the taxonomies or transition activities in general will be beneficial if the regulatory objective is to minimize the emissions intensity of the energy mix. So I think an example like that can is just an example to illustrate how a decision of inclusion and exclusion shouldn't be just taken in silos. You have to think about the justification for it, how to convince the market that it's a credible decision.
And if I may to just add a couple of examples of standardization and localization, right? So if you look at, energy, renewable energy, it's highly standardized across different parts of the world, from EU taxonomy to ASEAN to China to the Hong Kong prototype, right? Highly standardized, so pretty much the same. So when investors look at a green bond that is used to fund solar, it's the same across the board. But the localization would be different, in certain activities. For example, in my early slide, if you look at, the cement, petrochemical, this kind of high impact sector, the fact that we provided a range is to reflect the standardization and localization aspect. Because if you think about manufacturing of cement, steel, right, it really requires, the grids are so different from China to other part of the world. So you cannot standardize that. It has to be really reflecting, the local grid, the local technology, breakthrough, so on and so forth. So the range would be very helpful for the market to take into account. Another aspect of example of standardization and localization is do no significant harm. You cannot standardize it in a way. Obviously, you standardize that this is a key consideration that you need to incorporate. But how do you implement will reflect the local characteristics. So, for example, if you look at Hong Kong and mainland China, for any large infrastructure, it requires environmental impact assessment. In itself, it's a do no significant harm measure to look at, if you build this bridge or whatever, you have to do thorough environmental assessment to make sure that it does not create significant harms, outside one particular environmental objective, right? So that itself is an example of localizing do no significant harm as a standard global consideration.
Thank you, Chowny. I can tell from the look on the expression of our audience that you are all eager to have a more in-depth discussion with our panelists, but if I may just keep them for one more minute. In one or two sentences, Willie, Chowny, and Dr. Chen, what do you think is the number one thing that should be included in the next phase of Hong Kong taxonomy?
Transition. I have been talking about transition for maybe 3 years now, 3 long years. So I was very excited when the budget, specifically including the expansion of transition activities, and Willie's sharing that transition activities is part of the next phase, right? So this will be highly anticipated, and I believe this will really yield a lot of benefits in terms of driving capital to support the hard-to-abate sectors.
Yeah, same here. If I think so far we have been concentrating or focusing on green, but actually a large part of the journey, if we are going to meet the climate goal, is transition. So I think the key, one of the key to the achievement of climate goal is transition. So transition and transition.
If I may copy your answers, credible transition, right? So because it's just transition, yeah. So very often investors, ESG investors, they tend to use this simplistic negative screening strategy, and downside of it is that it tends to discriminate companies from hard-to-abate sector or high-emitting sectors. But there are definitely companies that are more willing and more capable of actualizing the transition. And the question is, how do we tell them apart? And I think to buttress the credibility, we need more data disclosure, and we need to have a framework to understand, okay, how to tell these companies apart. I think this is a very important opportunity to support those that are really eager to transit and capable of transiting, rather than those that are just transition washing. So this is my take.
Thank you. Transition, incredible transition. Thank you so much for your sharing today.
Thank you, Andrea, and our presenters. Welcome back, everyone. In our next panel, speakers will discuss how taxonomies can support financial institutions and corporates' climate risk assessment, sustainability disclosure, business development, etc. Please welcome our moderator, Ms. Chang-Ni Kwan, Managing Director, Head of Sustainable Capital Markets APAC at BNP Paribas, as well as the following panelists: Mr. Gabriel Wilson-Otto, Head of Sustainable Investing Strategy at Fidelity International; Ms. Carmen Zhang, Head of Sustainable Investment Banking Greater China at CACIB; Ms. Nikki Chaik-Obi, Senior Director, Head of APAC ESG Ratings and Research at Sustainable Fitch. Welcome all.
Thank you very much for staying with us. And I think Gabriel just take our panel to the next green level with his own cup. Excellent. Okay, so I hope you really recharge and replenish after the coffee break. So for this panel, we have lined up a great lined up of panelists. These people do not require any further introduction from me. They are basically the ESG veterans of the industry, from the investment side, the bank side, and financial service provider, right? So I think that's actually a great mix, thanks to the organizers, from different perspectives to really look into the implementation challenges and opportunities of taxonomies, right? So I guess without further ado, I might just, ask a question that's common to all of you. Like, from your perspective, in your day-to-day, what does taxonomy mean to your industry? And how do you adopt taxonomy in your day-to-day work? Does it really help? Maybe I'll start with you, Gabe.
Cheers. Thanks, Charlie. So coming from an asset manager standpoint, taxonomies are absolutely critical from a few different areas. First up, we're trying to create products that meet our clients' expectations. If there's not a common language for communicating those expectations and which companies are able to contribute positively to different outcomes, that makes it really tough, because it means that different clients in different parts of the world could have completely different expectations for what is a green activity, or what does climate change mitigation actually mean. And so you actually end up with a very challenging situation of trying to have consistency of products, but without a consistency of terminology to underpin it. So in that first element of meeting client expectations, taxonomies are super helpful. The other challenge here is that we are increasingly needing to report on our funds and also the overall characteristics of our portfolios as part of disclosure regulation that is popping up in Europe, in the UK, and also across Asia Pacific. With the inability to appropriately classify what we hold, those disclosures become less relevant. So if it's up to each manager to define what is green, you will get wildly different numbers that you then can't compare between different managers. So it effectively undermines the entire process if you don't have a high quality taxonomy to be able to compare. The other advantage is that it can really help the internationalization of capital flows, as you were highlighting earlier, Chang-Ni. And I think that's a really good point, because one of the key challenges for transition or green finance is convincing the person you're selling the product to that it is actually transitioning or is actually green. So if we get a green bond that's being issued or a transition bond, in the absence of a taxonomy or standard, my team has to do a huge amount of work on every single asset to make sure that it meets our own internal definition. And then if I go and try and sell it to one of our clients, we then have to convince them that our internal definition is appropriate. A taxonomy allows you to cut through all of that. And so it significantly reduces due diligence costs and enables capital to flow a lot more easily between different markets, and also for that to make it a lot easier to create transitioning products. And this is a selfish reason. It also reduces regulatory risk or the chances of allegation of greenwashing. So if we label a product as transition and we're following a standard framework, we have the air cover of that framework for the integrity of what we're selling. So there's a lot less risk, which can really help facilitate growth. So super important from a range of different areas.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gabe, covering it from product development, capital flow, and regulatory compliance reasons from in terms of benefit of taxonomy. Maybe Carmen, as a banker who arrange green bonds as part of your day-to-day, how do you use it in your activities with your clients?
Sure. So as a bank, our key role in pushing for green finance, mainly there are two roles. First is for us to help our client to transition, support their low carbon transition via our green lending. And secondly is to, and that I think in general is supported by our, and guided by our climate strategy, sector decarbonization trajectory. And then secondly is, as you said, for us to facilitate our client in helping them structure and launch a sustainable finance product, and we have a key role in developing the markets via, having high standard, high quality transaction. And taxonomy is important in supporting these two directions. First, for green lending, for CACIB, before there's a flood of taxonomies, back in 2013, we drafted our own taxonomy, guiding our green lending. And now that the EU taxonomy is launched, we think it's important, first, of course, to reference it, but we also need to recognize that taxonomy is not everything. We need to recognize that there are limitations to taxonomy. For example, we are facing, as a global bank, we're facing a global portfolio, so we need to make sure we are inclusive of other regions' green assets or transition story in our drafting our own taxonomy. So I think the key point is for green lending is recognizing there are limitations, and that taxonomy is a evolving documentation and guideline. And the second point towards market development, of course, that is ultimately, really important for all stakeholders to reference the taxonomy to avoid greenwashing, and it also, really highly facilitates our process of structuring a transaction, and also, facilitate the subsequent disclosure of the impact of the transaction.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Carmen. I think that's a really good point, in terms of limitation of a single taxonomy, if I understand you correctly, right? So it's important to reflect the local characteristics of various countries or markets that you operate in. And I guess that's where the regional and local taxonomy can really come in to supplement the overarching taxonomy that you have at headquarter level. Okay, Nika, you service everybody from issuers to investors. How does it reflect, in your day-to-day with the taxonomy?
Sure. So what we are trying to provide through our ESG ratings is more transparency to the market. So we're sort of sitting in between the issuers who are looking at their overall business and a potential labeled bond issuance, and trying to communicate to the market how they feel that bond issuance is going to contribute to environmental or social sustainability. And then we also need to communicate it to investors, which, as Gabriel mentioned, many of them have their own reporting requirements. So in terms of our use of methodology, our use of taxonomies, the EU taxonomy was a very important part of building our original methodology when we started the ESG ratings journey. Obviously, the EU taxonomy was the first one, and there's benefits to being the first, but there's also things that I think that have been learned over the coming years, and some of the newer taxonomies we've seen are taking different approaches. So the EU taxonomy, being very science-based and robust is great, but it actually doesn't cover quite a few economic activities. So like Dr. Keith mentioned before, agriculture doesn't exist in the EU taxonomy, green or not green, it's just those activities are not eligible. But obviously sitting here in Asia, we have a lot of companies that are involved in activities related to agriculture, and so we have to find a way to assess those. So taxonomies are useful as a starting point, and they're also useful for differentiation, because our ratings have, you know, a range of 5 scores. There can be activities that are green, but whether or not they are considered excellent, good, or average is also going to be based on certain technical screening criteria included in taxonomies, for example. So that's guidance for us. Something that's useful from the issuer perspective, I think, for taxonomies is it helps them look at their business and understand how much of their day-to-day revenue-generating activities are actually aligned to taxonomies. And so I think the introduction of the pure player label that the ICMA brought out has been quite interesting. We've had a number of Asian issuers that we've worked with that have actually been surprised to find out that they do qualify as pure players, because a significant portion of their activity is actually fully sustainable, low carbon or zero carbon technology that they didn't even realize. So this is very, very powerful for a company that's looking to go to the market with something where they can say, myself, here are my finances, but also I'm almost completely aligned with the EU taxonomy. That makes it very attractive to investors who are looking for opportunities where they can support businesses that are further along in the sustainability journey. So I think that's something that will develop more as time goes on, and creates really good opportunities to find those businesses that maybe wouldn't have gotten so much attention from international investors otherwise.
Can I actually just ask you a follow-up question, immediately? You mentioned, the taxonomy, let's just say EU taxonomy, right, in itself. Even, looking at I think it's 300 or 400 pages, thick Bible, and you said there's still a chunk of activities not being included. So how do you do, what do you do when activities are not within the taxonomy? How does, can your methodology address, that kind of limitation to make that green assessment?
Sure. So we look at other taxonomies. So we've looked at CBI. The Singapore Asia taxonomy has a number of different activities that are not included in the EU taxonomy. Where there's no coverage of a taxonomy, you'd be surprised. There's all sorts of random activities. We're discussing universities and certain things a university might do. I mean, very niche activities, right? In that case, we look as much as we can to, IPCC, other scientific references, and we actually have a whole committee process. So if there's a new score that's proposed, a senior analyst has to chair, and it's a very formalized process. So we try to make it, we document very clearly, but we also have changed things, because as time goes on, for example, we've seen thresholds move, we've seen gas come in as a transition activity in the EU when originally it wasn't. So we have to be able to respond. We want to make sure that we're reflecting what the market sentiment is, and we're not being too restrictive and saying, oh, you have to be 100% perfect to be considered good, but at the same time we don't want to be totally off and find out that we're giving very negative scores to things that the market is actually coming around to accepting as being a sustainable activity.
No, that's a really good point, right? That, basically the taxonomy is not the answer to everything. There are ways, there are tools, resources that you can reference as long as they are credible to point out to a robust, net zero pathways, right? I think that's something that, market participants really need to reflect, rather than solely rely on the taxonomy, because it's also natural that the taxonomy, either it's EU or ASEAN or Singapore and the future Hong Kong taxonomy, it's not a document, that would comprehensively cover all the activities. It's always a very dynamic process to continue to expand, to reflect market needs. So I think it's natural in a way that, if you come across a green bond or loan that is not currently can be referenced, any existing taxonomy yet. Okay, great. Thank you so much for your sharing so far. And to people in the audience online and here, please keep your questions coming. I'm monitoring the iPad as we speak, so I'll pick your questions. I see Willie is taking a lot of notes, so this is a perfect opportunity to bring your questions, and as Will HKMA is drafting, the Hong Kong taxonomy. Okay, I have a second round of question for my panelists. So you talk about the importance of taxonomy in your day-to-day. What are the key challenges and pain points that you have experienced in adopting the taxonomy in your line of work? Maybe I'll start with the ladies first. Comment this time.
Sure, sure. On this front, a few points. The first one is on, it's been mentioned several times on the interoperability of the taxonomy. I think the CGT is an amazing initiative to address that, but it's a bit more than that. When we talk about interoperability, I think it's really important we think about the market architecture. We need to make sure that taxonomies or the recognition, this mechanism of common ground taxonomy can be integrated in the regulatory requirement of different jurisdictions. For example, earlier we talked about the European regulation, banks, financial institution, we got to report a green asset ratio. So would CGT aligned assets be considered as, under the EU taxonomy, also an eligible green asset ratio? So technical issues like that, I think it would be important for us to address, maybe more for regulators and authorities. But in the market, this is a key concern. And then the second one definitely, again, is on transition, right? We know that there's a need for transition. And to share a little bit of findings, Gabriel can see if he concur. We have done some surveys among ESG-focused investors in Asia, and it seems that actually taxonomy alignment is not always a mandatory requirement when they make an investment decision into sustainable bond. But the most important factor is actually whether that sector, whether that company has a credible transition trajectory or planning. And so on this front, I think also to the point of applauding the Hong Kong government, Hong Kong MA, in including the transition element in the taxonomy. At the same time, I think we should recognize that in Europe we also almost have this waves of over-regulation. People are really almost scared of greenwashing. But Asia, we're still at the stage that we're not that scared. We are still here to innovate, and we recognize the need to transition. And so it's important, again, to emphasize when we develop taxonomy, it is important to take into account the transition element.
Thank you. Nika? Mm-hmm.
I'll echo some of Carmen's thoughts, I think, on the issue of EU regulation, which, because of the way that they structure the regulation, affects companies that are operating in Asia and other parts of the world. So the two kind of disclosure regulations that are currently a bit contentious at the moment are the ones that are really affecting non-financial corporates. So that's the CSRD and the CSDDD. One is just sustainability disclosure for the company itself, and one is within the supply chain. I think those of us who work in financial services are used to regulation. We deal with regulators a lot. There's a significant amount of reporting. There's a well-structured compliance infrastructure in these organizations, and we're a little bit more used to approaching that. A typical corporation, especially one that may have significant operations in the EU but is not EU-based, this is a huge hurdle for them to meet these types of requirements. Just having the internal resources to deliver high-quality sustainability reporting is not easy. We work with a number of companies around Asia who engage us to give an ESG rating on themselves, and it is a learning process for most of them. In many cases, they realize what they don't have in terms of policies and procedures, in terms of international peers, through the process of going through an ESG rating mandate with us. And so I think when you're looking at some of those requirements, which is trying to bring the entire economy, the real economy, into the EU taxonomy, the hurdle for companies to meet is very, very high. And that's why you're seeing pushback, delays, and even now within the EU itself, national governments are saying that these are too difficult for these companies to meet. So I think that's one challenge that we're facing, is just the expectation on companies is beyond their current capacity. Another thing on transition as well, I think one of the areas that we really need to, I think all those of us who are involved in this space, we have to be very careful with how we as a community define transition. I think the Singapore Asia taxonomy does a really nice job of giving technical screening criteria for transition activities, but just a few weeks ago, the Indonesian government allows new coal to be considered a transition activity if it's in service of the nickel industry. I think it's very, very hard to convince most international investors that new coal, even if it's going to be retired by 2050, would be a sustainable activity, but they have allowed it. And so we need to kind of keep an eye on how the term transition is being used and incorporated into different countries and regions, because it is starting to get to a point where the definitions are no longer compatible. And that just gives a little bit more headache to people like Gabriel who have to try to understand how these assets can fit into a certain type of portfolio.
I think that nicely lead to Gabe. How do you see the pain points?
I'd put them into two broad buckets. So one is around calculation and the other is application. And so if we think of calculation of taxonomy alignment, the key challenge is actually data. So as you get more science-based and explicit, it actually gets harder and harder to get the right data to calculate it. And I do have a lot of sympathy with issuers if you're operating on a global basis and you're being asked for a different metric from every taxonomy you need to comply with. You might want to step back and say, what are you actually asking me to do? Which of these taxonomies is right? And from my perspective, it's one reason why I'm personally a massive supporter of common metrics but different thresholds. So taxonomies need to be context specific. You can't have one threshold for the world. That effectively gives developed markets a free kick and makes it impossible for emerging markets to meet the criteria. So that's not productive. We need context-specific thresholds, but if we're not asking for a similar set of metrics, the interoperability between different taxonomies becomes very, very challenging because you just can't compare what one taxonomy is saying versus another. You have to go through line by line and try and uncover the sorts of issues that were just highlighted. So on calculation, we need to be very careful on making sure that we have the data, that it's scalable and appropriate and based on consistent set of metrics. Application is the other challenge here because if we look at the percentage of assets that are EU taxonomy aligned, depending on the data provider that you use, you will get ballpark around 5% of Europe being aligned and low single digit 1, 2, 3% depending on the provider of a broader based equity index or global index. The challenge with that is not sufficient to build a wide range of diversified financial products. So the question becomes, if you have clients that come to you and say, I want just really dark green products, that comes with a very significant skew to the risk and opportunities that they're actually taking on board as an investor. And the absence of transition products means that you're effectively ruling out a huge swathe of emerging market activities, which could have really meaningful positive contributions, but in the absence of classification, can't be at scale classified and put into those products. And so for me, that application side is one of the reasons why I think that I'm super positive about transition criteria. I think it's critical for Asia. I think that the wrong approach is lowering this bar for green and trying to put a lot of products into it. I think we need to keep green science-based and transparent, but we need that amber category to lean on the Singapore or ASEAN taxonomies of categories which may not meet the green scientific threshold, but are clearly a significant step in the right direction or on the right trajectory towards achieving that threshold. I agree that transition is really context specific and really difficult and needs a lot of collaboration and work to get there. But I think it's a really good ambition and absolutely critical for the region. We can't transition Asia without transition criteria. So it will effectively just not allow the capital to flow where it needs to. And then you end up with capital going towards projects which are good, but may not be the best use of that money in terms of the dollar per tonne of carbon removed. And then my final complaint, while I've got the mic, is that one of the real big challenges here is moving beyond transition. We've been talking about environmental taxonomies. If you look at social taxonomies, that is a next standard and next level of complexity when looking at what we need to drive. Typically, the way this is done is looking at it through both an operational perspective, so looking at how do you operate, what do you do as a business, as well as the product and service you do. So it could be through your employment standards, or it could be through running a hospital. That running a hospital, everyone agrees, that's the area that's relatively easy. The operational standards is where it gets incredibly subjective. And so I think that, again, there's a huge amount of complexity here, but the clarity around why a decision has been made and the traceability or metric used to justify that, and that transparency becomes critical for communication and comparison.
I'm starting to worry about Willie and Georgina's work-life balance with many of your asks here. So we gave you the air to, the time to complain, to address your pain points. Can we have some solutions? How can we address some of the challenges? You have to.
Okay, I can't just complain. That's what I've been told. So I actually think that, so first up, I am a big supporter of common ground taxonomy. I think it's a really good way of saying where are the overlaps. So how do we actually think about internationalizing or comparing some of these? And you're effectively doing issuers and investors' homework for them. So thank you very much. You do the first step of analysis so you know where to look. What, for me, the next step from there is that consistent metric and local threshold step. So it's saying that if power generation in the EU is 100 grams per kilowatt hour, what's that number for Hong Kong? What's that number for mainland China? What's that number for Indonesia, for Malaysia, for different markets around Asia Pacific? And then what that allows us to do is to have a common language when we're talking about alignment. We'll all be using the same terms. We'll be asking issuers for one metric to assess them by. We won't have a huge range of different criteria depending on which market you're in. And it also allows comparison between taxonomies. So it allows the user to determine which threshold and standard they want to apply. Are they applying it for an Asia transition standard, or are they very strict and want to just apply an EU standard for their own purposes? So it allows that flexibility, and it means that the data and taxonomy is not just market specific. It actually allows you to use the data and leverage it in a global context. So for me, I know that's super hard. It's not like, and power generation is one of the easier sectors. When you start trying to look at all of the technical criteria and how that would actually be broken down by market, it's hugely complex. But I think that that style of proof of concept can be a really powerful way of starting to align investors and issuers around expectations.
And if I just coming to address some of your points, right? When it comes to common metrics but different threshold, that's something that we actually uncover in our research that we showcased earlier. So for example, in the 3 transition activities that we highlighted as an example for manufacturing cement, manufacturing steel, and petrochemicals, we actually look at 2 common metrics. One is the energy-based model in terms of how much gigawatt energy used, as well as a carbon matrix. And in fact, China is promoting a carbon matrix model in terms of measuring the unit of impact. So I think with the push in terms of disclosing carbon emissions or intensity level, absolute level, it really helps to allow investors or financial market participants to compare how green or how credible the transition is between these cement manufacturer versus the other cement manufacturer, right? So that's something that we actually have done more homework, in the CGT's phase 3 research. So feel free to go on HKGFA website to download that piece of research. And I think you mentioned some of the really good points in terms of, the common ground taxonomy, right? So if you go back to the China Green Finance Committee work in 2023. There was huge exercise with the support from the industry, obviously, looking at over 200 green bonds that are outstanding, in the market, and found that they are actually aligned to the CGT, right? So itself, it really helped for the markets to understand that actually there's a good degree of alignment to international standards, and in a way to provide confidence to international investors, international capital to flow into China's onshore market. So I think, we are seeing some good measures, but good progress to address some of the market difficulties. common, solutions that you can, you can propose to
Very
market
hard.
regulators and participants here?
I think two words is use it. Because now,
Just do it.
In fact, just do it. Because in fact, there are already, as said, taxonomy is an evolving process. It's a living and breathing document. It's not that document is not set in stone. So it is important for us to have this conversation, for corporate to use it to guide their transition or green investment pipeline, to manage the pipeline, for banks to use it to guide their green lending, for us structuring banks to use it for labeling ESG products, for companies to track and measure how green they are, how they are at the transition pathway that they need to be. So there are already existing tools. I think we already heard so much. Singapore, ASEAN, CGT, use it.
Wonderful. I love the message. Mika?
I think I would agree with a combination of both what Carmen and Gabriel said. I think viewing the taxonomy as a document that can be changed and updated, I think the ideal is using the kind of CBI approach where there are sunsets for different levels. And so over time, the standards for what counts as transition get stricter and stricter. I think that allows the real economy companies to make adjustments to their operations to anticipate what they will be able to label under certain things when they have financing needs in the future. So for example, if we look at what the EU has done for motor vehicles, they started to reduce the threshold for what will be allowed for tailpipe emissions. And so by 2026, what will be considered taxonomy compliant is only going to be zero emissions vehicles like battery or hydrogen fuel cell. But at the moment, there's still allowance for hybrid vehicles to be considered taxonomy eligible. So that's allowing for the technology development within the auto industry to move from the pure combustion to the hybrid to the battery technology, and also giving consumers an opportunity to try those technologies in the process of decarbonizing. So I think being clear about that. Another example I can think of, Japan has come to the market with a big sovereign transition bond just a couple weeks ago, and they're coming back with another one that's going to price. The Japanese transition approach, which is not a taxonomy, they've been very clear about that. It's an industrial strategy. They have a lot of activity-based categorization, but they don't have so much of thresholds, like emissions thresholds, energy thresholds, things like that. And so an example I was just talking about in the coffee break was there's some transition financing in Japan that has financed lower carbon ships, but the ships are actually carrying fossil fuel. In the Singapore Asia taxonomy, they specifically excluded any marine transportation that is primarily carrying fossil fuel is not eligible under the Singapore Asia taxonomy. So that kind of additional information provides more transparency to the market, because then investors can come and say, if I'm considering two shipping companies, then the additional question I need to ask is, what is the purpose of this ship? What is it going to carry? Is it carrying coal, or is it going to be carrying wheat? Is it going to be carrying some other type of product that's less carbon intensive? So I think putting those thresholds in makes it easier, and then it kind of takes away the amount of homework that the investors have to do when they're evaluating it, because they know exactly what they're looking at.
Right, the devil's in the details, really. Excellent. Well, we have questions from the audience. Let me just shout it out loud. What is the intended application of taxonomy in Hong Kong? Will banks allow to follow head office adopted taxonomy or other taxonomy? Will the same standard be applied to securities firms or other financial industry participants to maintain same level of playing field? Who wants to take the first step? Banks? Carmen? Yeah, banks.
I think for banks, maybe it's more for a question for regulator, but we can.
We have them here.
I think we can draw experience from what's happening in Europe, and it's important for us to not, after all the discussion, for us to not take taxonomy as a restricting factor, but more as a supportive factor to support the growth of the markets. So again, like taking Credit Agricole as an example, even after the launch of the EU taxonomy, we still keep our own green financing taxonomy internally because we understand the limitation of the existing EU taxonomy with a scope of eligible categories, and not just that, and also because in terms of the environmental objective as well, we talk about a lot about climate change mitigation, but what about climate change resilient, biodiversity, and also on the the social side, talking about just transition. So it is important for banks to have their own interpretation and not just limit themselves by the. It's important to reference it. It's important to use it as a guiding document in tilting your lending portfolio towards green sector, but it's not everything. And I think it is important for the market development going forward for banks to be allowed to have their own stance in integrating taxonomies.
Excellent. You want to add?
I'd just add quickly that in my view, a taxonomy is not about restricting activity. It's about enabling activity through consistency of classification and definition. So globally, the approach has been, if you would like to follow an existing taxonomy, it can be an easy way of having that common language and communication. If you choose to adopt an internal standard or different standard, that's on you. But the challenge is then communicating that standard and convincing the counterparty that it's an appropriate standard for the use case.
Excellent. Second question, taxonomy is a new area to explore. When developing, do we mainly rely on research? Would it turn out to be too theoretical? Maybe I can ask Nikkei as the head of research at Fitch.
Can it be too theoretical? I mean, I think there are a lot of people who would say so. I think if you went to talk to people who are operating factories and heavy industry, they would say, what you're asking from me is unreasonable. I think particularly in this part of the world, a lot of these industrial companies, they are consuming energy from a grid that they don't control. And if that grid is primarily, dominated by coal and fossil fuel, they feel that they're being expected to meet a standard that is not realistic for them. Of course, you can find companies that are operating at best of class, even in those challenging circumstances, and are investing in their own renewable energy generation, but those are unusual. And those are usually companies that are either extremely connected to the international economy or have some kind of visionary leader that's decided to take that step. And so as we develop more carbon pricing and carbon markets in Asia, and that the cost of that transition becomes more priced into their daily operations. But I do think there is definitely a view, certainly probably outside of the financial sector, that some of these conversations happen in a bit of an ivory tower, and that when it's applied to regular companies, they feel that it's perhaps more difficult for them. But, I think it depends how seriously you take climate change, right? If you think it's an existential concern, then, going full force towards it makes sense. And so it's just a difference of opinion, perhaps.
And just to add, if you look at a lot of taxonomies, right, when they are formulating, there is actually a collective effort from the industry together with the regulators. I mean, EU taxonomy was few years in the making, with a massive working group, with different parts of the different part of the economy, from real economy to financial participants, together with policymakers, right? So there's input from different aspects to shape the taxonomy. And when it comes to the technical thresholds, it doesn't just come from research. It actually comes from industry output, industry performance in terms of looking at average performance and best-in-class technology. So it actually came from reality rather than theoretical research. So I hope we answer your question here. We'll take the final question before we close the panel. It's a general ESG question. What are the key aspects you look at when evaluating a company ESG performance? Maybe just very concise from anyone who wants to take it. You, Gabe?
I'll struggle to be concise.
Your stewardship moment.
No, this is, so if we're evaluating a company's ESG performance, there's two key components to it. One is around the materiality of the issues that matter for that company. So it's not the same set of metrics for all companies everywhere in the world. It's what matters for a company, its context and stage of development. So what we're effectively saying is the company strategically engaged with the ESG issues which are the most material for that company? And this means that it's not just about disclosure, it's not just about reporting a number, it's actually how does this influence the strategy of the company? Are the people at the most senior level of the company having the sorts of discussions around risk mitigation, opportunity identification, and is this baked into just how they do business and the culture of the company? That's probably the biggest single thing that we're looking at when assessing an issuer. That's the high-level quick answer. Below that, there's a huge number of metrics, best-in-class performance, guidance, how things can improve, specific milestones that we use for engagement and assessment and classification of companies. But it all boils down to answering that big-picture question.
Yeah. And taxonomy can come in. Exactly. Right. Anyone want to supplement, Nika? You assess companies' ESG performance in your research, in your rating.
Sure. I guess if I can summarize it, the kind of two categories we look at is what does the company do? What is it selling? What services does it provide? And we evaluate that. And then how do they do it? So that's how they treat their workers, their supply chain, gender pay ratios, and those types of things. So those are essentially the two factors that we're looking at.
Comment?
May I just, from a we're banks, we're not investors, but we observe that just to share, there are, on this aspect, we like to highlight there are different models, like each investor may have their own priorities and focus in terms of ESG. It's just the same as ESG rating. We have many different ESG ratings that they have different focus and weighting on the E, S, and G factors, and that goes to the same. So there's no, well, those are great answers, but that I think it's important to point out, at the moment, there's no official one single answer to that.
Brilliant response. Because what I completely should have mentioned is that the first question is, what do you mean by ESG performance? And so that's which is...
I'm rolling my eyes, Gabriel.
Exactly. But that goes to exactly what we were just saying. Is it what you're doing? Is it the products? So is it saying, are you a renewable company? Or is it trying to look at actual corporate governance risk from ownership or other sorts of challenges that might exist? Are you looking at risk? Are you looking at opportunity? How are you classifying it? And different ESG ratings, different investors, different banks, different clients will have different priorities and weights that they put on these different topics. And then they'll have different approaches to classifying it. So the answer I gave is how we look at it personally, which is more of a looking at longer term, are you integrating risks and opportunities? There are other ratings that focus purely just on, do you have SDG alignment? Do you have the right products and activities? So there's a huge spectrum there, and we need to be very careful of a one-size-fits-all ESG word. But sorry, I couldn't resist not jumping into this. Carmen's point was fantastic. I just wanted to elaborate on it.
That's good. Well, I think this gives me very little time to conclude, but you guys have done a fantastic job answering the questions that we prepare and questions from the audience, and I'm sure there's a lot of follow-up for HKMA and other regulators in the room here in terms of localizing the taxonomy and use it as an enabling tool to allow financial participants to really raise capital, to direct capital towards the much needed dark green and transition area. So I guess with that, I want to really thank my panelists and the organizers today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chowny, Gabe, Carmen, and Ika.